All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me here first thing in the morning on day 2 of Black Hat. I'm here to talk to you all about software supply chain attacks. By way of quick introduction, my name is Ryan Kazanciyan. I'm Chief Product Officer at Tanium. I'm based out of Alexandria, Virginia, right outside the DC area. I've been in the security industry for, almost 15, 16 years now. Started out at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I focused on audit, penetration testing, and application security work. Moved over to Mandiant, spent 6 years leading incident response investigations for targeted breaches, and then most recently have been in Tanium. I also, during that time, co-authored Incident Response and Computer Forensics 3rd Edition, did some previous work at prior Black Hats on PowerShell attacks and Windows DSC, and in the last 2 years also spent a lot of time in my second job working with the Mr. Robot production team on Seasons 2 and Seasons 3, getting things like struts attacks and IDA Pro and other realistic hacks that we wove into the show incorporated with the writing and production team. So let's talk about where this all started. And I'm going to begin with a brief timeline of software supply chain attacks and how I got involved in this research. It actually began with really humble origins. So I had moved to a new home, and I had a bunch of crates full of DVDs of movies and TV shows that I wanted to rip so that I could stream them instead of having to deal with discs. And so to do that, I used Handbrake, a really popular tool for Mac OS that allows you to encode ripped video files, and so then you can stream them with Plex or whatever media server you want. So I'd been using Handbrake for a while, churning away encoding disks, and what was striking to me is I read in the news a couple of months later that Handbrake had been hacked, and for a period of a couple of days, if you had downloaded Handbrake from the website or from Homebrew, you actually got a malicious version that was delivering a variant of the Proton Mac OS malware framework. And that was really striking to me because I ostensibly have a security background and try to stay fairly safe out in my day-to-day usage of my home computer. And I realized if I was just unlucky enough to have downloaded the software at the wrong time, I might have been popped. And then, of course, a couple weeks after this was the infamous NotPetia attack, which began, as many of you might know, with the compromise of a Ukrainian accounting software package called Medoc. And this was very strategically chosen to have a show of force in terms of the impact and damage that this breach ultimately ended up having. So what I started to do is chart out all of these supply chain attacks and get a broader sense of how many there actually were, how prevalent they were, and if there were any common threads or trends that I was seeing among them. And so as I started to look back in time, I found that there were quite a few, some of which had actually kind of flown under the radar going back as early as 2012, 2013. And then I did an initial version of this presentation in late 2017, and going all the way up to that, there had been a flutter of additional supply chain attacks targeting trusted software. And then in the past year, I've continued to do this research and really try to understand whether there were going to be continuing and evolving trends. And as you can see, it's been an extraordinarily busy 2-year period in terms of software supply chain attacks against a variety of different targets proliferating in the past years. If you look at each of these attacks, they all have their own interesting story and objective and means. For instance, UltraEdit. Really popular text editor used by a lot of developers and engineers. This was targeted in what Microsoft called Operation Wiley Supply in 2017. And the period of exposure was only 1 day. And according to the reporting, about 24 companies were targeted in what was really a fairly targeted compromise. You contrast that with when Web Developer extension on the Chrome Web Extension Store was popped. That was a 3-day exposure period, and millions of users were exposed. That wasn't meant for targeted compromise. That was actually a means by which to distribute adware. And then finally, CCleaner, which happened right after NotPetya and Medoc. That was also a very large exposure. A malicious version of CCleaner was being distributed for over a 1-month period, and over 2 million people downloaded it. But just like a watering hole attack, the post-compromise activity that Cisco Talos observed only impacted 18 firms. And these are, of course, a very small subset of a much broader ecosystem of supply chain attacks, those targeting enterprise software, end-user software, software development tool chains, SaaS and software providers, hardware and firmware, and so on. For the purposes of this presentation, especially because we have about half an hour, I'm going to focus only on 2 major areas, enterprise software and end-user software, and briefly touch on development toolchain as well. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what's driving these attacks, because ultimately compromising a trusted software vendor to get access to a victim is a fairly difficult way to breach someone. And so it was interesting to me to think about why this is even a trend. If you go back to the early to mid 2010s, and when I did a lot of incident response work, we saw this quite often. One of the many ways attackers would get access to targeted victims was the classic watering hole. So in a watering hole attack, if you want to get access to a certain set of victim companies, you compromise a website that you think those victims are likely to encounter, and then you get a whole bunch of victims, and of that entire mass of victims, you might only pursue secondary command and control on a subset that you care about. And so we saw a lot of APT groups using this technique. We also, in the 2010s, saw the proliferation of exploit kits that package together a whole bunch of browser exploits against either the browsers or the plugins they use, and then sell those so that crime or criminal organizations and other opportunistic attackers could make easy use of them. So you had stuff like Rig, stuff like Black Hole, really compromising millions and millions of users for different purposes. Then what happened? Starting in around 2013, we saw a shift in browser market share. Chrome, ostensibly a pretty well-designed, really secure browser, starts to take over. Internet Explorer starts to dwindle. We start to see users using ad block software, not just the really technical expert users, but we see mass adoption of ad block software, which also has a side effect of suppressing, in some cases, malicious JavaScript. And then finally, we saw, thank goodness, the death of plugins. We saw Flash go away. We saw Java plugins start to go away. We saw browsers start to disable these by default. And all of these started to shrink the attack surface of exploitable web browsers and the plugins they use. And as a result, we saw a decline in exploit kits. Rig, for example, had a precipitous drop in the 2017 period, and really all the other major exploit kits followed suit. There was a brief surge in early 2018 that you'll read about that was triggered by two 0 days that were released in close proximity. One was in Flash, one was in IE, but by and large, exploit kit activity has really died down. And the introduction of new exploit kits has, in parallel, also died down quite a bit. So what are attackers left to do? How do they adapt? Well, there's still many other ways that you can compromise victims, of course. One is simple social engineering. So if I lead someone to a website and convince them that it's a good idea to download and execute install flashplayer.exe, there's no real exploit there other than tricking a user into running something they shouldn't. And so we see a lot of that. We see abuse of functionality that is legitimately baked into productivity applications. So why not have your spreadsheet able to launch a command? That makes total sense. So things like the DDE attack and the slew of Office productivity application exploits that leveraged native functionality built into these tools to do bad things. And then finally, I think software supply chain attacks has emerged in this space as another option for attackers to fill the void that the lack of browser exploits has left behind. So what else contributes to why, as a general ecosystem, we're vulnerable to these types of attacks? I think there are a couple of factors, and the first begins with attackers getting really savvy at subverting our trust mechanisms. And in particular, I want to talk about signed code and digital certificates. So we use code signing as a means of demonstrating integrity in the software that we create and trust. And one of the interesting trends on the timeline that I analyzed was which of the supply chain attacks incorporated the use of signed malware. So everything bolded here used signed malware at some step of the payload. The ones with an asterisk actually used a different digital certificate than the original developer. So in some cases, they were able to compromise the certificates of the originating software publisher. In some cases, they just signed stuff with other certs that had been previously stolen or obtained. When I actually worked cases in the early 2012, 2013 time period, this was happening a lot more often than reported. So one example is in 2013, there was a lot of publicity about a hacking group that had attacked Apple, Facebook, Twitter, and a slew of other technology companies. And I worked a few of the non-publicized cases here. And one of the things that this gang was really good at was stealing digital certificates and going after the code signing infrastructure at technology companies. And you knew they were good at it because the malware they would use at one victim was digitally signed by prior victims. And in most cases, when you do the IR, you'd find that those certs had still not been revoked. Finally, a couple years later, academia started to do broader research on this. One study done in 2017 looked at a corpus of malware on VirusTotal, found a fair number of signed samples that they examined, and found that they were comprised of about 112 stolen certs, and 80% of those had not actually been revoked, even though they had been in use for, in some cases, several years. So clearly, attackers know how to sign software to evade security and trust mechanisms. A more recent study followed in this past year and showed that in addition to attackers stealing certificates, there's also a growing underground economy of shady certificate brokers that are issuing not only code signing certs, but even, if you have the money for it, authenticode certificates, which have a higher bar and also offer for an attacker the ability to evade a lot of security controls that will intrinsically trust something that has an authenticode cert. The second factor is the sheer software diversity that we encounter in most organizations. And I really like this diagram that Halvar Flake tweeted a couple of years ago, showing just the web of trust graphs that exist when you consider all the software that runs on your computer. And in an enterprise context, I look at this at two different layers. And the first begins with the vendors that your companies and your employers trust to provide the software that they buy. And when people talk about businesses dealing with supply chain attacks, they're usually focused on this, like looking at your vendors and the software that they're providing, because that's at least a smaller space of things to deal with. In most enterprises, organizations, not surprisingly, trust and use a lot of enterprise agents, things that run persistently on all of your endpoints. Every year, the Ponemon Institute does a study of this, and the most recent results from 2017 showed that 32% of organizations have 6 to 10 endpoint agents, 27% have 10 or more agents. That is a lot of long-lived, persistent code running on every endpoint that probably has a whole slew of dependencies that each of them carry along. What gets really scary, though, is when you compound that against all of the software that your end users install on their computers to do their jobs or all the other stuff that they want to do on their work computer. And that's where the number of trusted software or implicitly trusted software starts to really explode. So in my day job, this is something that we work with companies a lot on tracking. And the metrics are actually pretty staggering. So if you were to take a ratio of number of endpoints to the number of unique versions of software that are installed, in smaller environments, that ratio is 5 to 7x the number of endpoints. So if you have under 100,000 endpoints, you can expect 5 to 7 times that number in unique pairings of applications and versions of those apps. In larger networks, that ratio expectedly goes down to about 1 to 3x. But to give you a specific example, one of the organizations I've worked with 230,000 endpoints, has 400,000 unique application version pairings. And that is a tremendous amount of software to worry about, to manage, to monitor, and to assess if it's actually secure. It's pretty much an impossible task. And so how do security teams in most companies cope with this diversity? Well, they have to make some really tough trade-offs. One is if you're using antivirus or if you're trying to use something like application whitelisting, you start to create more and more policy exclusions to allow through all of the uncommon good that might otherwise trigger your security controls. And sometimes that leads to overly broad exclusions that are necessary just to allow people to run good software and get their jobs done. It also makes hunting and monitoring really, really difficult and frustrating. Anyone who's done proactive enterprise hunting at large scale has probably encountered the bane of uncommon good. And oftentimes the difference between obscure software that's auto-updating and a initial dropper for malware is really, really narrow. They often look exactly the same. And so this is really difficult for hunting teams and leads to a lot of noise that they have to cope with. All right, so with some of those factors in mind, let's now turn to the trends and patterns that we've seen in supply chain attacks in the past year. The first is the emergence of cryptocurrency payloads, and I really like this tweet about it. A firewall exploited to install a Docker container that spawns a Bitcoin miner to steal CPU. What a time to be alive. The cryptocurrency payloads incorporate things like cryptocurrency miners for things like Monero. Also, theft of data, so like stealing wallet information, basically in-browser man in the middle of transactions, things like that, all fall under what I call cryptocurrency-related payloads. If you look at the timeline that we started out with, clear clustering here. A significant portion of the software supply chain attacks that I've been tracking since about mid-2017 have been cryptocurrency focused. And in many ways, and maybe I'm biased from doing a lot of targeted APT-type incident response work, I look at this as a massive waste of a great foothold. Because if you look at the number of victims, or at least the exposure that these attacks had, it's enormous. And you could have done really, really evil, bad things with access to this many endpoints. But instead, they targeted either crypto mining or cryptocurrency theft and didn't really make a whole lot of money from at least what I can tell. But yeah, the most recent one is NPM event stream package. This just happened a couple of weeks ago, or at least was publicized a couple of weeks ago. 8 million people exposed over a 3-month period where this open source NPM package had been subverted. The Docker user image hub, the user submitted image hub, 17 images sat on the Docker hub for 10 months with cryptocurrency miners built in with no one noticing. That's actually not true. A few people did notice and tried to file notices to get them removed, but it took 10 months for that to happen, and 5 million people downloaded them in the interim. We've had browser extensions like Mega, the Mega downloader extension had been compromised. You can see the list here, lots and lots of infected users. The only one that actually had a public record of the dollar impact or the money that the attackers made was the Docker case. They earned about 545 Monero coins, which is $90,000. That's not a trivial amount of money, but again, I think about the exposure that was here, and attackers could have done a lot worse. We got away lucky. Conversely, if you look at the targeted APT-esque compromises, what was interesting to me is most of these occurred prior to 2018. Now, I think there's one of 3 things happening here. The first is that these are continuing to happen and not getting publicized. I'm skeptical of that because security firms love to publicize stuff, even anonymously, because it's great marketing. The second is that it's still happening and not being detected. I'm reasonably confident that's probably the case. And the third is that it's probably not the most common way that targeted breaches are happening, and I believe that as well, because it is still a lot easier to, say, spearfish someone than to try to pop software that a company happens to trust. Finally, challenges with the detection and response time. You would hope that we would get better at detecting and responding to this stuff quickly over the years, but right now we're still in that very immature early stage where, just like when targeted attacks first happened and the only way victims found out was when law enforcement did victim notifies, same sort of thing is happening today where we have a handful of examples where these attacks were caught within a day, and good on them, that's awesome, and then quite a few that took a month or longer to get detected. These are approximations based on the publicly available data that I was able to glean, so not super precise numbers, but you get the picture. It's still longer than you'd hope. And what's also compelling is in almost every single one of these cases, save for 1 and 2, it was an external means of detection, meaning either a user, a security researcher, or a security firm notified the software owner that a breach had occurred, not self-detected. If you read some of the ways that the open source community or user communities detected these, it's both cool and terrifying. So like the Mega extension used by millions of users, a Reddit user discovered that it had been hacked. And the way they did it was they noticed a permissions change when they updated the extension. They posted on Reddit about it. A few people took a look at the JavaScript and they realized, hey, something nefarious got injected in here. In the NPM event stream case that happened a few weeks ago, as I mentioned, this was live for 2 to 3 months. Basically, the original owner of this package decided they didn't want to update it anymore. Someone emailed him and said, hey, I'll take this over. He gave him access to the repo, and then that person committed malicious code. There were people who noticed something was awry over that 2 to 3 month period, but it took that long of time for someone to finally nail down that, yes, there was malicious code here. And again, millions of people had downloaded it. Finally, as scary as all these examples were, there were a few that could have happened that didn't, that would have been much worse in terms of scope of attack. In 2017, a researcher took some of the public password disclosures from other breaches and determined that they could have used those passwords to gain access to 14% of NPM packages, including, if you track all the dependencies to those packages, 54% of the entire NPM repo. 15,495 accounts. Tremendous level of exposure that could have been led to some really nasty breaches. One that really struck me was Homebrew. So how many here use Homebrew? How many of you diff and check the source code that gets pulled down every time you run brew update? Yeah, I don't either. And a researcher this year found that through a series of information leaks and vulnerabilities, in 30 minutes, he was able to get commit access to the brew master branch. And so he could have committed anything he wanted there, and then if you ran brew update, you would have pulled down his malicious code. And the point he made in the Medium article that talks about this is if he could have done this in 30 minutes, then a nation state probably could have done a lot worse. And I suspect probably has, if not in Homebrew, somewhere else. And that is really unsettling. So with all these scary things in mind, how do we respond? And again, I want to focus on the enterprise lens here because many of you probably work in organizations that are trying to defend against these attacks, and you're not going to be able to tamp down all the software that's out there. So how do you manage your attack surface for enterprise software and for end user software? The first point begins with assessing your visibility. So many of you probably have EDR tooling in your environment that is continuously recording everything that executes along with the file and network activity that performs. And that's really useful as a starting point if a supply chain attack gets disclosed and you need to hunt it down in your environment. There's another layer of software identification which is predicated on what's on disk. In other words, EDR telemetry is good at giving you a rolling history of what runs, but that needs to be complemented with an inventory of files at rest on your endpoints and the dependencies of those files at rest. And then finally, that needs to ultimately be blended in with normalized application inventory, things that track the metadata about the versions of softwares that group together packages, not just by file name and hash, but by common software groupings and entities. And this is often in the remit of teams that do systems management rather than security. If you're on the security team, it's a good idea to buddy up with the IT ops teams that often own this data because you may find that it's a really valuable complement to your EDR tooling. Second is level of coverage. A lot of companies have this tooling. Many don't have it across all of their end user workstations and servers in a consistent manner. And so ensuring if a supply chain attack gets disclosed that you can find a given piece of software and a version on any system anywhere in your global environment is really critical. And then finally, understanding the accuracy and timeliness of the data. How often is it refreshed? How far back does it go? How readily searchable is it? These are all really good things to consider when preparing for this. The second is managing your endpoint software. One of the interesting ways many organizations I'm working with are starting to track risk, among other factors, is looking at how they can minimize the application sprawl for both enterprise and end user software over time. And if you use that sprawl as a metric for quantifying how well you're normalizing your environment, it's actually a really salient data point to get some better control over the risks of exposure of uncontrolled software, especially software that updates itself on its own. For more mature organizations, and many of you might work in places that do this, they might have an end-user self-service catalog. So this type of functionality is available in a lot of systems management tooling. The basic idea is you have an end-user portal where a user can opt into certain software that your company is centrally managing and then distributing. Now, this doesn't stop a company from inadvertently introducing a compromised piece of software into the catalog, but it at least drives consistency and control across your organization. And I would argue the security benefits of that consistency and the ability to respond quickly outweigh the risks of potentially having to assess what you bring into that catalog. And so this is another good way to drive better control over what software is on end user systems. This is especially salient for browser extensions. And if you're not using something like Enterprise Google Suite, this is often a pain point. Can you get an inventory of every extension on every browser in your environment? And more importantly, can you actually start enforcing control over that? Both Google and Firefox provide GPO hooks now. So if you're using group policy, you can actually define whitelists or blacklists of allowed extensions and exercise more rigor here. But what I typically find is most organizations are completely blind to the browser extensions that are installed, let alone exercising control over which get used. One other thing I'll note, Google is doing some really good work on extension security in the web store after dealing with some of these breaches. I think starting next year, they're going to require two-factor authentication, for example, for developer accounts to stop things like account takeovers from occurring. Finally, catching post-compromise activity. If you're familiar with the attack matrix, you know that the initial compromise phase is one of a very broad array of activities that attackers perform after they've breached an organization. And so when you're popped by a supply chain attack, it's not game over. Like, you still have all of the opportunities to detect and stop an attacker as they move throughout the attack lifecycle. They're going to have to drop second stage malware, establish persistence, steal credentials, and so on. And so all of these are opportunities to detect and contain and respond that remain relevant in a supply chain attack. And with that in mind, you can actually use this information and what I've just covered here to incorporate supply chain attacks into your tabletop exercises and see how your organization would respond. The Tabletop Scenarios Twitter account, Bad Things Daily, has actually tweeted a few good examples of this. Malicious code distributed to your endpoints during routine update of assigned application. Or, as we just discussed, a Chrome extension is sold to a malicious developer and a bad update is introduced. Really interesting things to work through in a tabletop scenario next time you're assessing your organization's security. All right. As if the present wasn't terrifying enough, I also wanted to close out by thinking a little bit about what the future of these attacks might look like. And an interesting area that I kind of narrowed down on was on data providers. What got me thinking about this is the explosion of investment in machine learning-driven startups across all industries, certainly security, as you've all seen. And one of the challenging things with any security startup, and especially one that's trying to incorporate data science, is getting access to your data to train your models. If you're Microsoft, you have telemetry from 1 billion Windows computers. You have all the data you could want. If you're a startup, you don't have an agent running on every computer out there in the wild. So you have to gather your data from open source intelligence, repositories like VirusTotal, and that means you're basically using external data sets to kind of drive the models that you build and how you train them. And so what this leads me to is worrying about how all of the startups that are relying on open source models and open source data, how safe those data sets are and whether they can be poisoned. Yesterday, Black Hat Arsenal had a great talk from Maria, oh gosh, I'm blanking on her name now. She's with IBM, and she did a whole talk on adversarial attacks, and IBM's published a toolkit around this. There have been a few really interesting presentations and white papers on this in recent years, and one that I've cited here from this past year talks about attacks where taking publicly available data sets that are often used to train machine learning models and then modifying a single pixel in those images can be used to basically corrupt the training procedure and cause misclassification of images. So as the example shows here, you take a single pixel change, and all of a sudden you can break the model in a way that a frog gets identified as a plane and a plane gets identified as not a plane. Take this concept and think about it with the publicly available data people might use to train ML models used to classify, is this malicious versus is this legitimate? And you can start to think about what I'm worried about here. All right, so to wrap things up and put things in perspective, Dr. Ian Levy at the NCSC was talking about supply chain in the context of responding to Kaspersky, and talked about how most of the incidents that have caused actual harm to businesses and organizations here in the UK have not been caused by supply chain attacks. They've been caused by the basic hygiene factors of not keeping your software up to date, poor configuration management, poor credential management. So as compelling and terrifying as these attacks are, don't panic. Really, there are more fundamental things that you should still focus on. But what I think is important is that software supply chain attacks are just another means of initial compromise. In the end, the same foundational principles for attack surface reduction, for detection, containment, and response all still apply. The second point I had made is that you should really focus on ensuring you have a complete, timely, and accurate record of all software that is either at rest or has executed on all of your computing devices. And once you have that and have confidence that you can maintain and monitor and search and analyze that, then you can drive towards stronger governance over what's actually deployed and installed on your endpoints. And then finally, if you're working with enterprise software vendors, challenge them. Ensure that they're attesting to the investment and attention that they're applying towards supply chain risk. Because as I said before, we all trust a lot of software, and the solution space of vendors that we choose to work with and do business with is a good starting point for ensuring that we're trusting the right companies that are applying the right due diligence to this problem. Thanks for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will also have a copy of these slides on the Black Hat site and on my speaker deck site, but we have a couple of minutes, so are there any questions that I can answer? All right. Well, if you'd like to grab me one-on-one, I'll be lingering around after the talk. But thank you all and have a great rest of your conference.